He is not supposed to know how to do this. It is a few minutes past 8 in the morning on the 7th of December, 1941, and the battleship beneath his feet is being torn apart. Torpedoes have opened her side. The harbor is on fire. Planes are coming in low over the water, and a young sailor stands on the ruined deck with his hands on an anti-aircraft machine gun, firing up at the attackers. There is only one problem with this picture, and it is the whole of the story. This man has never been trained to fire that gun. He has never been trained to fire any gun. The Navy he serves has decided that men like him are fit only to cook and clean and wait on the officers, and it has made very sure he was never taught to fight. And now, with his ship dying under him and the sky full of the enemy, he has taken hold of a weapon nobody ever meant to let him touch, and he is fighting back anyway. Before we go on, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now back to that burning deck at Pearl Harbor, and to the sailor at the gun he was never allowed to hold. To understand what he did, you have to understand what he was, and what the Navy of 1941 would and would not allow him to be. He was a black man in a segregated service, and in that Navy, there was exactly one path open to a black sailor. He could be a messman, a steward, a cook. He could serve the food and clean the quarters of the white officers and sailors he was not permitted to fight alongside. He would not be trained on the guns, would not be given a combat role, would not be trusted by the official policy of his own country with the defense of the ship he lived on. That was the rule. On the morning of the 7th of December, on the deck of a burning battleship, he broke it. His name was Doris Miller. Everyone called him attendant, a cook, aboard the battleship USS West Virginia, and he was 22 years old. Everything you are about to hear is documented in his Navy cross citation, in the Navy's own records, in the accounts of the men who were on that deck with him. What he did at Pearl Harbor is not legend. It is on the record, however long the record took to admit his name. The man was real. What he did was real, and he did it for a country that had told him, in the plainest terms, that he was not good enough to be trusted with a rifle. Doris Miller was born on a farm outside Waco, Texas, in 1919, a big child and of physical presence people noticed. He worked hard, helped on the farm, and in 1939, looking for steadier work and a way to see something of the world, he joined the United States Navy. He was 19. He was strong enough and willing enough to do anything the Navy might have asked of him. But the Navy of 1939 had already decided what it would ask of a young black man, and it was not much. They made him a mess attendant, because that was the only rating open to him. He cooked and he served and he cleaned, and he did it well, and aboard the West Virginia he became something of a figure anyway, because he was the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, a man no one wanted to face in the ring. But his strength and his willingness did not change his place. He handled other men's food and other men's laundry. He was never posted to a gun, never drilled on the weapons, never included in the fighting part of what a warship is for. If the ship ever went into battle, his job was to keep out of the way and tend the wounded. He was, by the deliberate design of his own service, a spectator to the war he had volunteered to fight. It is worth being plain about what that meant, day to day, for a man like Doris Miller. He lived aboard a warship as a kind of servant, in a navy preferring folk were expected to fight, and he was told that his part in that war, should it come, was to stay below and out of the way. The messman's branch was where the Navy placed every black sailor, regardless of his intelligence, his strength, his courage, or his desire to do more, and there was no ladder out of it and up into the fighting Navy, because the fighting Navy was closed to him by the color of his skin. Miller was one of the strongest, most capable men aboard the West Virginia. The Navy had decided in advance that none of that would ever matter. He cooked and he cleaned and he boxed and he waited, though he could not have known for what. The morning of the 7th of December began, for Doris Miller, like any other. He was up early, collecting laundry an ordinary Sunday aboard a battleship at anchor in a peaceful harbor. And then, a little before 8, the world came apart. The first Japanese plane swept in over Pearl Harbor, and torpedoes began slamming into the battleships lined up along the moorings, and the West Virginia, hit again and again, began to flood and settle and burn. General quarters sounded. Every man ran for his, and Miller ran for his, which was a magazine deep in the ship, only to find it already wrecked by the torpedoes. Gone, useless. So he went up, toward the deck, toward the fighting, because there was nothing else to do, and men up there needed help. What he did first was not glamorous, and it mattered enormously. The deck was a scene of horror, wounded and dying men everywhere, and Miller, one of the strongest men aboard, began carrying them, hauling injured sailors out of the path of the fire and the flooding toward whatever shelter remained. Among the men he came upon was the ship's captain, Mervyn Bennion, mortally wounded on the bridge, hit in the abdomen, and unable to move. Miller helped carry his own captain to a more sheltered spot, one of the men who tried to save the life of the officer commanding the ship. Bennion would die of his wounds, but the big mess attendant had gone into the worst of it to try. The West Virginia was taking a beating that would have finished a ship less well handled. Something like 7 torpedoes tore into her port side, and bombs struck her from above, and she began to roll, threatening to capsize the way. The battleship Oklahoma was capsizing a few moorings away, trapping hundreds of men inside as she turned over. What saved the West Virginia, and the men still aboard her, was the quick work of her crew in counter-flooding the ship, deliberately letting water into the other side so that she settled upright onto the harbor bottom instead of rolling over. She sank, but she sank on an even keel, and because of that many of her men lived and could go on fighting from her decks even as she went down. Doris Miller was one of them. And then Doris Miller did the thing that made his name. On the deck were anti-aircraft machine guns, and their crews were dead or wounded or overwhelmed, and the planes were still coming. Miller, who had never been trained on the weapon, who by the rules of his Navy was never supposed to touch it, stepped up to a 50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun, and he figured it out, and he opened fire. A cook, a man the service had judged unfit to be a fighter, stood on the burning deck of a sinking battleship and fired at the attacking aircraft, learning the weapon in the doing of it, sending up what defense one determined man could send. How many planes he hit, no one can say for certain, and it hardly matters. The sky over Pearl Harbor that morning was full of attackers, and they were skilled and determined young men doing their own country's terrible bidding, and they had achieved almost complete surprise. Against that, one untrained sailor at one machine gun was a small thing, but he was not firing because he expected to turn the battle. He was firing because his ship and his shipmates were under attack, and he had found, at last, a way to fight for them, and no rule and no policies, and no idea about what a man like him was allowed to do was going to stop him now. He kept firing until the ammunition was gone, and then, with the order given to abandon the sinking ship, he helped still more wounded men to safety, before he went over the side himself. When the order finally came to abandon the sinking ship, Miller did not simply save himself. By the accounts of the men who were there, he went on helping the wounded, moving injured sailors through the smoke and the oil-slicked water towards safety, one of the last useful things a strong man could do on a dying battleship. He had carried the wounded before he ever reached the gun, and he carried them again after the gun fell silent. The fighting had been the extraordinary part, the part that reached the newspapers. But bracketing it, before and after, was the quieter work of a big, calm man, simply saving whoever he could reach, which was the truest measure of him. When the order finally came to abandon the sinking ship, Miller did not simply save himself. By the accounts of the men who were there, he went on helping the wounded, moving injured sailors through the smoke and the oil-slicked water towards safety, one of the last useful things a strong man could do on a dying battleship. He had carried the wounded before he ever reached the gun, and he carried them again after the gun fell silent. The fighting had been the extraordinary part, the part that reached the newspapers, but bracketing it before and after was the quieter work of a big, calm man, simply saving whoever he could reach, which was the truest measure of him. In May of 1942, aboard a carrier in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, personally pinned the Navy Cross on Doris Miller's chest, the first African-American ever to receive that decoration, the Navy's third highest award for valor. Nimitz said that day that he hoped it marked the start of a change in how such men were regarded. Many people, then and since, believed the award should have been higher, that what Miller did merited the Medal of Honor, and a campaign to see it upgraded continues to this day. But whatever the medal, the point had been made on the deck of the West Virginia in front of everyone. The man the Navy had trusted only with the dishes had proven, under fire, to be as brave as any fighter aboard. The question of the medal has never entirely gone away. Many who studied what Miller did concluded that the Navy Cross, high as it was, still fell short of the Medal of Honor his actions deserved, and that the gap had less to do with the deed than with the color of the man who performed it. Over the decades, members of Congress and veterans and historians have pressed again and again to have the award upgraded. It has not happened, but when Admiral Nimitz pinned the Navy Cross on him in 1942, he said he hoped it was the beginning of a change, that the day would come when such distinctions of race would be gone from the service. That day was a long way off, and Miller did not live to see any of it. But he had pushed the door open with his own hands on a burning deck. The Navy, having a hero it had almost failed to name, now made use of him. His story, told to encourage black Americans to enlist even as it celebrated him, kept the segregated unit still even as it celebrated him. He toured segregated units doings in the bespoke And then he did what he had always wanted to do, which was to go back to sea and serve. He was assigned to a new ship, an escort carrier called the Liscum Bay in the Pacific. And he went back into the war. On the 24th of November, 1943, in the waters off the Gilbert Islands, a Japanese submarine put its way into the Liscum Bay, and the ship's aircraft bombs detonated, and she blew apart and sank in minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Gore. Doris Miller was among the more than 600 men lost. He was 24 years old. The cook who had picked up a gun at Pearl Harbor, who had forced his own country to say his name, was gone 2 years after the morning that made him famous, into the same ocean he had volunteered to defend. It took a long time for the country to finish catching up to Doris Miller. Ships were named for him, a destroyer escort first. And then, in 2020, the United States Navy announced that one of its newest and largest aircraft carriers, a warship of the most powerful class ever built, would be named the USS Doris Miller, the first carrier ever named for an enlisted sailor, and the first named for an African American. The service that had once refused to train him on a gun, that had at first refused even to print his name, would send a 100,000-ton warship across the oceans of the world with that name on her bow. That is the whole story, and it is worth holding both halves of it at once. Doris Miller lived in a country and served in a navy that told him, formally and clearly, that because of his color he was not fit to fight, only to serve. And when the moment came, on the worst morning that Navy had ever seen, he carried its wounded and manned its guns and fought for it anyway, with a courage that shamed the rule that had bound him. He should not have had to prove it. He should have been trained and trusted like any other man from the start, that he was not the country's failure, not his, and that he rose above it, that he fought for a nation that had not yet earned his loyalty and gave his life for it, 2 years later, is his glory, and it belongs entirely to him. The Navy took decades to put his name on a ship. He put it on history himself, in about 15 minutes, on a burning deck, with a gun he was never supposed to touch.